My name is Claire Bennett. At 32, I stood on the porch of my very own 237K Craftsman home in Austin, the keys feeling heavy and real in my palm. This wasn't a gift, not an inheritance. It was a dream I had been chasing since I was 15 years old, built with my own two hands, fueled by 17 years of double shifts and sacrificed weekends. But the moment that truly shattered me, the one that cracked the foundation of everything I thought I knew, wasn't the fear of the mortgage I was taking on alone. It was the look in my own parents' eyes when they showed up on my doorstep an hour later. It was a look that didn't see a daughter's triumph, but an unexpected problem, a prize that was never meant to be mine. What they didn't know was that their forced smiles and brittle hugs were the first threads of a web of lies I was about to unravel. A web that would lead back to secrets they had buried long ago. Secrets they would do anything to keep hidden. How did I go from being their hard-working, self-reliant daughter to an obstacle standing in the way of their plans? It all started not with a fight, but with the quiet hum of a dream finally coming true, the smell of fresh paint, and the echo of my own footsteps in an empty house that was finally, completely mine. But before that, it started with the squeak of worn-out sneakers on a greasy diner floor. The sound that defined my teenage years wasn't music or laughter. It was the rhythmic clang of the time clock as I punched out. At 15, while other kids were at football games, I was tying on a grease-stained apron at a small diner on the outskirts of Austin. The air was perpetually thick with the smell of sizzling bacon and stale coffee, a scent that clung to my clothes and hair long after my shift ended. I remember my hands, always chapped and smelling faintly of bleach and onions, carefully folding every dollar bill and dropping every quarter into a glass jar I kept hidden under my bed. Each coin was a promise. Each dollar was a brick for a house I could only see in my mind. My dreams were quiet things, nurtured in the exhausted silence of the late-night bus ride home. I'd press my forehead against the cool glass, watching the suburban houses blur past, homes with warm, glowing windows and manicured lawns. I didn't just want a house. I wanted a sanctuary, a place that couldn't be taken away, a space where I was safe, where my hard work meant something more than just getting by. That dream was my shield against the exhaustion that settled deep in my bones, the anchor that kept me from drifting away. And now, 17 years later, I was here. The flashback faded as I ran my hand along the smooth, cool surface of my new kitchen countertop. Fast forward to July 2025. The air in my Craftsman home didn't smell of grease. It smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Sunlight, thick and golden, poured through the large living room windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny celebratory sprites. My throat tightened. This was real. Every polished floorboard, every clean, empty wall was a testament to that teenage girl with the stained apron. A wave of emotion, so potent it made my knees feel weak, washed over me. Tears of pride, hot and sudden, welled in my eyes and slipped down my cheeks, mixing with the dust and the scent of possibility. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was a decade-long struggle made visible, a fortress built one saved dollar at a time. My voice echoed slightly in the beautiful emptiness of the living room, where moving boxes were stacked against one wall like a miniature cardboard skyline. "I did it," I whispered, the words feeling fragile and immense all at once. I spun around slowly, my arms outstretched, a goofy grin spreading across my face. It was mine. The thought was a drumbeat in my chest. Mine, mine, mine. That's when the knock came, a sharp, decisive rap on the front door that cut through my joyful haze. I wasn't expecting anyone. My brow furrowed as I walked over, peering through the peephole. My heart gave a little leap of surprise and pleasure. It was my parents, Richard and Ellen. I swung the door open, my smile genuine and wide. "Mom, Dad, what are you guys doing here?" "We wanted to be the first to congratulate you, sweetie," my mother Ellen said, stepping inside. She wrapped me in a hug that felt strangely brief, her body stiff. My father Richard followed, giving my shoulder a quick, firm squeeze. "It's quite a place, Claire," he said, his eyes already scanning the living room, moving past me as if I were just part of the scenery. An odd, cold flicker of unease pricked at the edges of my happiness. I'd worked my whole life to make them proud, to be the responsible one they never had to worry about. But their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. They were tight, practiced things, stretched thin across their faces. "Let me give you the tour," I said, trying to push the feeling away, my voice a little too bright. I led them through the rooms, pointing out the original hardwood floors I'd painstakingly restored, the big backyard perfect for a garden, the little breakfast nook I'd already pictured myself in, sipping coffee every morning. I chattered on, my words filling the space their silence created. They followed, nodding and making small, affirmative sounds, but their praise felt hollow, like polite comments made to a stranger. It was their eyes that gave them away. They weren't looking at the details I was so proud of. Their gazes kept sweeping over the space with a strange, calculating intensity. They weren't seeing my home. They were seeing an asset, a property. My mother ran her hand over a windowsill, but her expression wasn't one of admiration. It was something else, something I couldn't name. Resentment? Worry? We ended up back in the living room, standing in a triangle of awkward silence. "Well," my father said, clearing his throat, "it's a lot of house for one person." It wasn't a question, but it hung in the air like one. "I'll grow into it," I replied, my smile feeling frozen on my face. My inner monologue was screaming, "This house is mine, every nail, every dollar." But why do I feel like I'm about to lose it? The joy from moments before had evaporated, replaced by a creeping dread that coiled in my stomach. Their presence, which should have been a comfort, felt like an intrusion, a judgment. Why did their eyes linger on my home like it wasn't mine? Like I was just a temporary caretaker? What were they hiding behind those forced, brittle smiles? The unease from my parents' first visit clung to the air in my new house for days, a fine dust that settled on every surface my joy had touched. I tried to sweep it away. I told myself I was imagining things, projecting my own anxieties onto them. They were my family. They loved me. So, in a gesture of hope, or perhaps foolishness, I decided to host a proper dinner, a housewarming, an olive branch to bridge the strange, silent gap that had opened between us. I spent the afternoon turning the house into a home. The warm, savory scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the kitchen, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of new paint. I set the dining table with the good plates, the ones I'd kept in a box for years, waiting for an occasion just like this. The warm, recessed lighting cast a soft golden glow over the room, making the polished wood of the table gleam. Outside, the Texas twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange. Everything was perfect. It was a scene of domestic peace, a carefully constructed illusion I desperately wanted to be real. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the last napkin. Just a normal family dinner, I told myself. Everything is fine. They arrived precisely at 7, all three of them, my father, Richard, my mother, Ellen, and my younger sister, Laura. The moment I opened the door, the chill returned. They brought it with them, wrapped in their coats. They presented me with a bottle of cheap wine, their smiles as bright and flimsy as the foil on its cork. "The place is looking great, honey," my mother chirped, but her eyes darted around the room, taking inventory. Laura, however, didn't even pretend. She swept past me with a cursory nod and glided into the center of my living room, her arms crossed. She tilted her head, a slow, appraising smirk playing on her lips. She wasn't a guest admiring a home. She was an inspector evaluating a property. The way she ran her fingers along the back of the sofa, the way her eyes scanned the high ceilings, it was a gesture of ownership. It made the skin on my arms prickle. We sat down at the table, the perfect meal I'd prepared sitting between us like a buffer. The conversation was stilted, a clumsy dance of pleasantries. My father talked about his golf game, my mother asked about my nursing shifts, but their words were just noise, meant to fill the cavernous silence that pulsed underneath. I felt like I was performing in a play, every line memorized, every smile rehearsed. My own home felt like a foreign stage. It was Laura who finally dropped the curtain. She took a delicate sip of wine, her eyes glittering with something cold over the rim of the glass. "You know, Claire," she began, her voice deceptively sweet, "this is a really big house for just one person." Here it was. The same line my father had used, but this time it felt different. sharper. I felt my shoulders tense. "I like the space," I said, my voice steady. She let out a little laugh, a sound with no humor in it. "I was just thinking," she continued, placing her glass down with a soft click. "It's the perfect place for a fresh start. We could make it work. Family sticks together, right, Dad?" I turned to my father. He nodded slowly, avoiding my gaze as he cut into his chicken. "Your sister has a point, Claire," Richard said, his tone edged with a familiar, weary expectation. "Family helps family." The air thickened. The warmth from the oven felt a million miles away. My fork felt heavy in my hand. They couldn't possibly mean what I thought they meant. My mind raced, trying to find an alternative, a less monstrous interpretation. They want her to stay for a few weeks? A month? But I knew. I saw it in Laura's triumphant smirk and my parents' deliberate refusal to look at me. "What are you suggesting, Laura?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not suggesting," she said, her sweetness curdling into open arrogance. "I'm saying this works out perfectly. You've got all this space and I need a place to live. It's simple." My breath hitched. The blood drained from my face. This wasn't a request for help. This was a demand, a hostile takeover disguised as a family dinner. I looked at my mother, pleading with my eyes for her to intervene, to say something, to stop this madness. Ellen just stared down at her plate, her hands clenched in her lap, her silence a resounding vote of complicity. A tremor started in my hands. I put my fork down before I dropped it. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the table with the force of a stone. "No, that's not going to happen. This is my house." Laura's face contorted, the mask of civility falling away to reveal the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. Her voice rose, sharp and piercing. "Your house. You are so selfish. You always have been. Hiding away your money, building your little life while the rest of us struggle." "I worked for this." My own voice was rising now, disbelief warring with a tidal wave of fury. "I worked since I was a teenager. I paid for my own education. I saved for 17 years. This is mine." "You owe us this, Claire," Laura shot back, leaning forward. Her eyes were wild. "I need a fresh start." "We raised you to help family, not hoard for yourself," my father added, his voice low and laced with disappointment. It was his words that broke me. Not the anger, but the calm, righteous judgment. As if my success was a betrayal. The scene went blurry. The roasted chicken, the wine, the gleaming table, it all faded into a backdrop for their faces, twisted with a resentment I was only now beginning to understand. All those years of being the easy child, the one who never asked for anything, I thought it had earned me respect. I saw now it had only made me a resource to be tapped. Laura pushed her chair back violently, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. She stood up, her chest heaving. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She pointed a finger at me, her nail a tiny sharp spear. "I swear to you, Claire, you will regret this." She stormed out of the dining room, slamming the front door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, a definitive, shattering boom. My parents didn't move. They didn't look at her, and they didn't look at me. They just sat there, in the wreckage of the perfect dinner, their silence more damning than any shout. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, felt like it had dropped into my stomach, a cold, heavy weight. They want my house, after everything I've done. What is driving this madness? Laura's threat lingered in the air, a poisonous vapor. What did she mean? What could she possibly do? The week after the disastrous dinner was a lesson in silence. The house, once a symbol of my freedom, began to feel like a fortress under siege. Laura's parting words, "You will regret this," echoed in the empty rooms, a toxic whisper that slithered into my thoughts when I was most vulnerable, in the dead of night or in the quiet moments before dawn. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart leap into my throat. The stacks of unpacked moving boxes no longer represented a new beginning, but a life interrupted, a future stalled. There were no calls, no texts, not from Laura and not from my parents, whose silence was somehow even louder, a heavy, suffocating blanket of disapproval. I was an island, and the water was rising. I tried to push through it. I went to my nursing shifts, losing myself in the steady, demanding rhythm of caring for others. I'd come home, exhausted, and force myself to unpack another box, an act of defiance against the dread that had taken root in my stomach. But the peace I had worked so hard to build was gone, replaced by a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. I felt watched, even when I was alone. It was on a blistering hot afternoon, a week and a half after the fight, that the silence was finally broken. The air was thick and still, the kind of oppressive Texas heat that makes you feel like you're moving through water. I walked to the end of my driveway, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The metal of the mailbox was hot to the touch. I pulled out a small stack of mail, junk circulars, a bill, and one thick, crisp envelope made of heavy cream-colored paper. It had no return address, just a formal stamp from a downtown Austin law firm. But it was the names printed beneath the firm's logo that made the air rush from my lungs. Richard and Ellen Bennett, my parents. My hands began to tremble, a faint tremor at first, then a violent shudder. This is a mistake, I thought. Some kind of business matter. It has to be. But I knew. Deep in the cold, coiling pit of my stomach, I knew. Laura's threat wasn't just the empty rage of a spoiled child. It was a promise. I walked back to the house on unsteady legs and sank onto the top step of my porch, the hot wood burning through my jeans. The world seemed to shrink and sharpen, every detail painfully clear, the drone of a cicada in a nearby oak tree, the distant sound of a lawnmower, the rough texture of the envelope in my trembling fingers. For a moment, I just held it, staring at my own name and address typed in stark black ink. It felt like a verdict. My fingers fumbled with the seal, tearing the paper. I pulled out several pages of dense legal text. The words swam before my eyes, a meaningless jumble of jargon, and then phrases began to leap out, branding themselves onto my brain. Plaintiff, defendant, breach of familial duty, unjust enrichment, and the final soul-crushing paragraph, the one that laid their demand bare. They were suing me for the house, my house. They claimed I had acquired it under a pretext that violated a long-standing family understanding, and that its rightful purpose was to provide a home for my sister. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped me. It wasn't a slow creep. It was a tidal wave that crashed over me, stealing my breath and leaving a roaring in my ears. My inner monologue was a frantic scream. A lawsuit? From my own family? This can't be real. This is a nightmare. A scare tactic. They wouldn't. They couldn't do this. But the paper in my hands was real. The weight of it was real. The betrayal was real. My own parents, my mother and father, were trying to legally strip me of the one thing I had ever built for myself. As my hands shook, clutching the documents, something small and stiff slipped from between the pages. It fluttered down, landing face up on the dusty porch step. It was a photograph, old and faded, its corners soft with age. I picked it up. It was a picture of my grandmother, taken years before I was born. She was young, smiling a brilliant, hopeful smile, her hair styled in a way I'd only ever seen in her wedding album. She was standing in front of a house, but it wasn't her house, and it wasn't our old family home. It was a place I had never seen before. Seeing her face, a face I'd always associated with unconditional love and the smell of cinnamon, felt like a punch to the gut. How could her memory, something so pure, be tangled up in this venomous act? The photo felt completely out of place, a relic from a different, kinder world dropped into the middle of my nightmare. But it wasn't random. Its inclusion was deliberate. It was a message, a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. The panic began to morph, shifting into a deep, chilling confusion. The lawsuit was one thing, an act of cruel desperation, but the photograph was another. It hinted at something more, a secret buried in my family's past, an old story that was now being used as a weapon against me. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Why this photo? Why my grandmother? What secret was tied to this house that I had bought with my own money, a house I thought had no history before me? The questions swirled in my head, drowning out the fear with a new, urgent need to understand. What did this photo mean, and why in God's name was it linked to a lawsuit from my own parents? For 2 days, the lawsuit papers and the faded photograph of my grandmother sat on my kitchen counter. They were a blight on my new home, a constant, sickening reminder of the poison that had been injected into my life. The initial shock had receded, leaving behind a landscape of scorched earth where my trust in my family used to be. The panic was still there, a wild animal pacing in a cage in my chest, but something else was growing alongside it, a cold, hard fury. It started as a spark in the pit of my stomach and slowly grew into a quiet, determined fire. They had pushed me, expecting me to crumble. They had underestimated me. They had forgotten who I was, the girl who worked double shifts, the woman who built a life from scratch. I would not let them take it. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. On the third morning, I sat at my counter, the photo of my grandmother in my hand. Her youthful smile a stark contrast to the ugliness I was facing. I wouldn't let them tarnish her memory, whatever their twisted game was. My decision was made. This was a battle I couldn't fight alone. My fingers, steady now, typed Private Investigator Austin into my phone's search bar. The office of Detective Sam Carter was on the second floor of a tired-looking brick building downtown. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper files and stale coffee. Books and folders were stacked on every available surface, a chaotic but somehow organized testament to a life spent digging through other people's secrets. Sam himself was a man who looked like he'd seen it all. He had kind eyes, but they were sharp, missing nothing. He listened patiently as I recounted the story, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as the anger took over. The hardest part was sliding the lawsuit and the photograph across the scarred wooden desk toward him. It felt like a profound betrayal, handing over my family's darkness to a stranger. My hands were clammy, and I had to clench them in my lap to keep them from shaking. "They are my parents," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "My sister. I don't understand how we got here." Sam picked up the photo, holding it carefully by the edges. He studied it for a long moment, then looked at the lawsuit. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. He just nodded slowly. "People do strange things when they're desperate, Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "My job is to find out why." That simple, direct statement was more comforting than any hollow promise. For the first time in weeks, a sliver of hope cut through my despair. I was no longer an island. I had an ally. A few days later, we met at a small, quiet coffee shop far from my neighborhood. The clatter of cups and the low murmur of conversation felt a world away from the tension of his office. Sam got straight to the point. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a list of dates and locations. "Your sister Laura?" he began, his gaze steady on mine. "She told your parents she's unemployed and looking for work?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Well, she's been busy," he said. 3, sometimes 4 times a week. She's a regular at the WinStar Casino just over the Oklahoma border." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Casino. The room tilted slightly. Suddenly, a memory flashed in my mind, so sharp and clear it felt like it was happening all over again. Laura on the phone just before Christmas, her voice thick with fake tears, telling me her car had broken down and she needed $800 for the repair. She'd sworn she would pay me back. I remembered the pang of sympathy I'd felt, the immediate transfer I made from my savings, feeling good about helping her out. The memory soured instantly, turning rancid in my mind. The car repair, the overdue bills, the security deposit. How many times had I sent her money, believing her stories, never once questioning it? My stomach churned with a nauseating mix of shame and rage. I had been funding her addiction. "She has a gambling problem," I said, the words feeling foreign and ugly on my tongue. It wasn't a question. Sam nodded grimly. "A serious one from the looks of it. This isn't just about her wanting a free place to live, Claire. This is about something much bigger." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Your sister's in deep. This might just be the tip of the iceberg." My mind was reeling, trying to process this new, horrifying layer of deceit. But Sam wasn't finished. He tapped the old photograph of my grandmother, which I had brought with me. "About this," he said. "I started looking into property records connected to your grandmother's name, trying to figure out why they'd include it. Most of it is public record, but I hit a wall. There's a sealed family document from that era tied to her estate." "A sealed document?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "What kind of document?" "Can't tell yet," he said, shaking his head. "It's locked up tight in the county archives. It'll take a court order to get it opened, but someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure it stayed hidden." He let that sink in. The lawsuit, your sister's debts, and a hidden family secret all connected to this house. It's starting to feel like they're all pieces of the same puzzle. I stared out the coffee shop window, watching the blur of Austin traffic pass by. The city felt alien to me now, a place where my own family was plotting my ruin. The simple conflict over a house had morphed into a conspiracy, a dark web of lies, addiction, and secrets that stretched back decades. I felt a cold resolve settle over me, displacing the last vestiges of grief. I had to know the truth, all of it. If Laura was truly behind this, if my parents were willing to destroy me to save her, then I needed to know everything before it was too late. What secrets were hidden in that document, and just how deep did my sister's manipulation really go? The courtroom was exactly as I had imagined it would be, cold, formal, and utterly indifferent to the human tragedy about to unfold within its walls. The air was still and heavy, smelling of old wood, floor polish, and the faint, dusty scent of a million forgotten arguments. Sunlight struggled through the tall, arched windows, cutting sharp, unforgiving lines across the room that seemed to illuminate nothing but our collective misery. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Across the aisle, my family sat together on a single bench. My father, Richard, looking grim and diminished in an ill-fitting suit. My mother, Ellen, staring blankly at the wall behind me, and my sister Laura, the picture of wounded fragility. They were a united front, a wall of betrayal I was supposed to face alone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Then a sharp rap of a gavel silenced the room and my thoughts. "All rise!" the bailiff called out. Judge Patricia Hayes swept in, her black robes flowing behind her, and took her seat at the imposing bench. She was a stern-faced woman with intelligent, discerning eyes that missed nothing. She radiated an aura of no-nonsense authority that offered the only sliver of comfort in that suffocating room. At least here, the truth was supposed to matter. The proceedings began, a blur of legal jargon that went straight over my head. My entire focus was on my family. It was on Laura as she took the stand, her movements graceful, her expression artfully composed into one of deep sorrow. She spoke in a soft, trembling voice, weaving a masterful story of my supposed selfishness, of family promises I'd never made, and of her own desperate need for a stable home to get her life back on track. Lies. Every word was a carefully crafted lie, designed to paint me as a villain who had snatched away her one chance at happiness. I could feel the fury coiling in my gut, a hot, venomous snake. I wanted to scream, to stand up and list every dollar I'd ever loaned her, every late-night phone call I'd answered, every mess I had quietly helped clean up. But I sat silent, my jaw clenched, letting her performance play out. Then it was my father's turn. He looked 10 years older as he walked to the witness stand. His shoulders were slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. He sat down heavily, like the weight of what he was about to do was crushing him. His lawyer began the questioning, his voice gentle, coaxing, and then it happened. The twist I never saw coming. The lawyer asked why they felt so strongly that they had a claim to my house. My father took a deep, shuddering breath. "We had no choice," he mumbled, his voice thick with a pathetic sort of shame. He looked up, his eyes finally meeting mine across the courtroom, and I saw not anger but raw desperation. "We had no choice. Laura's debts were drowning us." The courtroom fell silent. He went on, the words tumbling out in a torrent of confession. It wasn't just a few $100s here and there. Laura had amassed a staggering amount of debt. And my parents, in a desperate attempt to keep the collectors at bay, had co-signed a consolidation loan for her. The amount made the air leave my lungs, $45,000. The number hung in the air, obscene and unbelievable, $45,000. It all clicked into place with a sickening snap. The frantic need for my house, the sudden aggression, the lies. It was never just about giving Laura a home. It was about liquidating my life's work to plug the gaping hole she had created in their finances. A sudden, sharp memory flashed through my mind. My mother, a few years ago, quietly telling me she'd had to sell some of my grandmother's old jewelry to cover an unexpected expense. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now I saw it for what it was, the beginning of the end. They weren't just enabling her, they were going down with her, and they had decided to use me as their life raft. My inner monologue was a single, repeating scream. They sold me out for Laura's debts? How could they sink this low? I was so lost in my shock that I barely registered Judge Hayes leaning forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. She addressed my parents' lawyer, her tone icy. "And what evidence do you have to support this claim of a familial duty?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "Is there a written agreement, a contract, any documentation whatsoever to suggest your clients have a legal stake in a property that Ms. Bennett purchased with her own documented funds?" My parents' lawyer stammered, admitting there was no physical evidence, only their testimony of a verbal understanding. A flicker of hope ignited within me, faint but real. The judge's expression was one of deep skepticism. The tension in the room stretched to a breaking point. She looked from my father to my lawyer and then to me. She held my gaze for a long moment before declaring a recess to review the testimonies. The gavel fell again, the sound final and deafening. The case was left hanging in the air, undecided. I watched as my family filed out of the courtroom, a small, defeated unit. They didn't look back. I was left alone at the table, the silence of the room pressing in on me. The flicker of hope was already being choked by a wave of crushing emptiness. With the truth of their betrayal laid bare, I had to face a new, terrifying question. If I won this fight, if I kept my house, what would be the cost? Would a victory here mean losing my family forever? The day of the verdict felt different. The air in the courtroom was just as still, the wood just as dark, but the oppressive weight of uncertainty had been replaced by a sharp, brittle tension. We were all there, arranged in the same formation as before, me at my table, them at theirs. My parents looked smaller somehow, hollowed out by their shame. Laura, however, vibrated with a furious energy, her eyes burning holes into the side of my head. She wasn't defeated. She was simmering. Judge Hayes entered without ceremony and got straight to the point. Her voice was clear and devoid of emotion as she summarized the case. She spoke of property law, of the burden of proof, of the complete and total lack of evidence to support the plaintiff's claim. Each word was a brick being laid, rebuilding the foundation of my life right there in that cold, sterile room. My lawyer put a reassuring hand on my arm, but I barely felt it. I couldn't take my eyes off my family. In the absence of any written contract, proof of financial contribution, or any legally recognized claim, the judge stated, her gaze sweeping over my parents, this court finds the plaintiff's case to be without merit. She looked directly at me. The defendant, Claire Bennett, is the sole and rightful owner of the property in question. Case dismissed. The final, sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of my victory. It was the sound of my freedom. It was over. A choked, furious sound ripped from Laura's throat. She shot up from her seat, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She gave me one last look, a look of such pure, unadulterated hatred that it chilled me to the bone, before turning and storming out of the courtroom, slamming the heavy doors behind her. My father buried his face in his hands. My mother just stared forward, her expression utterly blank, as if she had left her body and gone somewhere else entirely. I had won. The drive home was a blur. The streets of Austin, the familiar turns, the bright Texas sun, it all felt distant, like I was watching a movie of my own life. I walked through my front door, the keys feeling light in my hand now. The house was quiet. It was mine. The battle was over. So why did I feel nothing? I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by the unpacked boxes that had become silent witnesses to my turmoil. The victory that had seemed so monumental in the courtroom felt hollow here, in the silence of the aftermath. There was no surge of triumph, no cathartic release of tears. There was only a profound and deafening emptiness. The sunlight poured through the windows, the same golden light that had once filled me with so much hope, but now it just seemed to illuminate the dust in the air, the isolation. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was absolute. I won, but at what cost? This house feels emptier than ever. The thought wasn't just a fleeting whisper, it was a shout in the void. I sank onto the sofa, the quiet pressing in on me. A memory, unbidden, surfaced in my mind, a flashback to a Christmas from long ago, maybe I was 10. Our old family house was filled with the scent of pine and baking cookies, the sound of my father's booming laugh, mixing with my mother's singing as they decorated the tree. Laura and I were chasing each other, our own laughter echoing through the halls. The memory was so warm, so real, and it collided with my present reality with the force of a physical blow. That life, that family, was gone. I had fought to protect my sanctuary, only to find myself completely alone inside it. The next few days passed in a haze. I started unpacking again, the movements mechanical, robotic. I was trying to build a life on top of the ruins of my old one. One evening, I was on my front porch, watering a pot of ferns that had survived the neglect of the past few weeks, when my next-door neighbor, a friendly woman named Maria, came over. "I'm so glad to see you relaxing, honey," she said with a warm smile. "I saw the other day that your family's car wasn't here anymore. I hope everything is okay." I gave her a weak, non-committal smile. "Everything's fine. Just a misunderstanding." She nodded, though her eyes were kind with unspoken questions. "Well, that's good," she said, turning to leave. Then she paused. "Oh, that reminds me, I keep meaning to ask. I've seen your sister's car parked down the street a couple of times late at night. I figured she must be stopping by when I'm asleep. It's nice that you two are so close." The watering can slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the porch and spilling a dark pool of water at my feet. My blood ran cold. Laura, here, lurking in the dark. The image flooded my mind. Her car parked just out of sight, her eyes filled with that same courtroom hatred, fixed on my house, on me. Maria looked at me with concern. "Claire? Are you all right?" I forced a smile, my facial muscles feeling stiff and unnatural. "Yes, fine. Just clumsy." She left, and I stood there frozen, long after she was gone. The fragile peace I had started to build was instantly shattered. The legal threat was gone, but this felt infinitely more terrifying. This was personal, unpredictable. My home no longer felt empty, it felt watched. The victory in court was a legal fact, but Laura's war was clearly not over. Why is she still watching my house? What is her next move? The neighbor's words planted a seed of ice in my chest, and in the days that followed, it grew, its frozen tendrils wrapping around my heart. My victory in court, once a source of fragile relief, now felt like a cruel joke. I had won the battle, but the war had simply changed tactics, moving from the open field of the courtroom to the shadowy trenches of psychological warfare. My home, my hard-won sanctuary, transformed into a cage. Every night became a marathon of listening. I'd lie in bed, my body rigid, straining to hear over the frantic drumming of my own pulse. Was that the sound of a car engine idling down the street? Was that a footstep on the gravel driveway? The joy I'd once felt in the house's quiet emptiness was gone, replaced by a menacing silence that seemed to amplify every tiny sound. I started performing nightly rituals, walking the perimeter of my own prison. I'd check the lock on the front door, then recheck it. I'd walk through the house, making sure every window was latched, my reflection a ghostly stranger in the dark glass. I'd peer through the slats of the blinds, my breath fogging up the pane, searching the inky blackness for the shape of a parked car or a lurking figure. I found nothing, but that brought no comfort. It only meant she was good at hiding. The feeling of being watched was a constant pressure at the back of my neck. One night, the exhaustion finally caught up to me. I'd fallen into a fitful, dream-plagued sleep on the sofa, too afraid to go upstairs to my bedroom. The house was completely dark, save for the pale, bluish moonlight filtering through the living room windows. It was the jarring sound of my phone ringing on the coffee table that ripped me from my sleep. My heart exploded in my chest. I scrambled upright, disoriented, my mind still thick with sleep and fear. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it. Nothing good could come from a call at this hour, well after midnight. It had to be a wrong number, but what if it wasn't? What if it was my mom or my dad, something having happened? Despite everything, a vestige of that old familial duty remained. My hand trembled as I swiped to answer. I held the phone to my ear, my breath held tight in my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. For a moment there was only static, a faint electronic hiss. Then a voice spoke, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was low and raspy, digitally distorted to be completely genderless. It sounded like gravel being scraped across metal. "Claire Bennett? Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The distorted voice ignored my question. It was calm, unhurried, which made it even more terrifying. "You won the house," it rasped. "Good for you, but you didn't win the war." A wave of cold dread washed over me. This wasn't a wrong number. This was for me. "Is this Laura?" I snapped, trying to inject a strength I didn't feel into my voice. "Stop these games!" There was a dry, crackling sound that might have been a laugh. "Laura is the least of your problems," the voice said. "She's predictable. The people she owes money to are not. You need to watch your back." And then, a click. The line went dead. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more menacing than before. I stared at the phone in my hand, my whole body trembling violently. I let it slip from my fingers and it clattered onto the hardwood floor. "The people she owes money to." The words echoed in the terrifying quiet of my house. This wasn't just about my sister's bitter resentment anymore. This was about her gambling debts. The warning from Sam Carter came rushing back. "Your sister's in deep." My mind spun, trying to make sense of it. Was this a threat or a warning? A memory, sharp and painful, surfaced from the depths of my childhood. I was 6 years old, cowering under my covers during a violent thunderstorm, the lightning flashing, the thunder shaking the house. My father had come into my room and sat on my bed. He'd told me I was safe, that he would always protect me. The memory was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of how utterly alone I was now. The man who was supposed to protect me was the reason I was in danger. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard it. A distinct sound from outside, the snap of a twig, just beyond my living room window. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. The caller's warning, "You need to watch your back," replayed in my head. Someone was out there, right now. Moving slowly, silently, I slid off the sofa and crept towards the window. I kept my body low, my movements fluid, years of nursing emergencies having taught me how to stay calm under pressure. I knelt by the window, my eye pressed to the tiny gap between the blinds. At first I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees and the deep shadows they cast in the moonlight. Then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the larger shadow of my neighbor's oak tree. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a person, a dark silhouette, moving with a swift, deliberate pace down the street and disappearing around the corner. I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the wall, my legs too weak to hold me. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to stop my body from shaking. This isn't over. Someone's out there, and they know more than I do. The legal fight had been clean, brutal, but governed by rules. This was something else entirely. This was a faceless enemy lurking in the dark. Who was that on the phone? Who was that shadow outside my window? And what in God's name did they know about my family's plans? The silence in my house after the mysterious phone call was no longer just empty. It was predatory. I felt hunted in my own home, a prisoner of a threat I couldn't see or name. For days I existed in a state of high alert, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I knew I couldn't survive this alone. The thought of being found on my floor, having had a fear-induced heart attack at 32, was the grim motivation I needed. I had to reach out. I had to trust someone. There was only one person who came to mind, my coworker, Mark Rivera. He was a fellow nurse, a kind, steady presence in the chaos of the ER. He had seen me at my most stressed, had offered a cup of coffee or a quiet word of support without ever asking for anything in return. Swallowing my pride and my terror, I sent him a text. "Can we talk?" We met at a cozy, bustling coffee shop the next day. the kind of place filled with the cheerful noise of normal life. The rich smell of roasted coffee beans and steamed milk hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile fear that had become my world. I clutched the warm ceramic mug of my latte, the heat a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I started to talk, the words coming out in a halting, broken whisper. I told him everything: the lawsuit, my father's confession, Laura lurking in the dark, the distorted voice on the phone. Mark just listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't look at me with pity or disbelief. He just held my gaze, his expression one of deep, unwavering empathy. His quiet validation was more powerful than any advice could have been. A painful memory surfaced. Me, a few years younger, coming home after a grueling 14-hour shift where we'd lost a patient. I'd tried to tell my mother about it, my voice thick with exhaustion and grief, and she'd waved a dismissive hand saying, "Don't be so dramatic, Claire. It's your job." Mark wasn't my family, but in that moment he felt more like family than they ever had. When I finished, my story hanging in the air between us, he nodded slowly. "I'm so sorry, Claire," he said, his voice soft. "No one should have to go through that alone." He paused, then leaned forward. "I know a place, a group of people. They get it. They've been through things too. It might help." My first instinct was to refuse. The thought of spilling my guts, of laying my family's grotesque secrets bare for a room full of strangers, was horrifying. The shame was a physical barrier in my throat, but the alternative, sitting alone in my house, waiting for the next phone call or the next shadow to appear outside my window, was infinitely worse. I took a deep breath. "Okay," I whispered. The support group met in the sterile beige basement of a community center. We sat in a circle of mismatched chairs under the unflattering hum of fluorescent lights. My anxiety was a roaring fire. I felt exposed, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I sat with my hands clenched, ready to bolt. But then, people started to talk. A man spoke of his brother stealing his inheritance. A woman spoke of being gaslighted by her narcissistic parents. Their stories were different from mine, but the melody was the same. A symphony of shock, betrayal, and the painful process of rebuilding. In their voices, I heard the echo of my own pain. I saw my own confusion and hurt reflected in their eyes. I wasn't alone. The realization was a dam breaking inside me. Tears I didn't know I'd been holding back streamed down my face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of grief, but of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. I had found people who understood. On the drive home, the world outside Mark's car seemed a little brighter, the colors more vivid. A fragile sense of peace had settled over me. Mark, perhaps sensing the shift, finally spoke about something he'd been holding back. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said, his eyes on the road. "I didn't want to tell you this before, when you were feeling so alone, but now that you know you have people in your corner." He hesitated. "I need to be honest. I've heard whispers at the hospital. Some of the nurses know your sister or know of her?" My newfound peace faltered. "What kind of whispers?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It's just gossip, so take it with a grain of salt," he said carefully. "But the rumor is Laura's not giving up that easily." He glanced at me, his expression serious. "They're saying she's been telling people she was cheated out of a family inheritance, that she's been digging through old family papers, looking for something to prove it." The rumor hit me like a splash of ice water, snapping me back to the terrifying reality. The inheritance, the sealed document, the photograph of my grandmother, it was all connected. This wasn't just a desperate, flailing attempt at revenge. It was a calculated next move. He pulled up in front of my house. The porch light I'd left on cast a warm, welcoming glow, but the shadows around the edges of the property seemed deeper now, more menacing. The fear was still there, but it was different. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of isolation. It was the sharp, focused anxiety of a fight I was no longer facing alone. Maybe I'm not alone anymore, but can I let my guard down? The question hung in the air. Laura was planning something new, something rooted in the past. What was it? And could I truly place my trust in these new allies I had only just met? Mark's warning about an inheritance echoed in my mind, a missing puzzle piece that I now knew I had to find. Armed with this new information, I called Detective Sam Carter. The rumor confirmed his suspicions about the sealed document. Something was being intentionally hidden. While he continued to work on getting the official court records unsealed, he used his resources to track down a loose end from my grandmother's estate, a small leather-bound trunk that had been sitting in a dusty storage unit for over a decade. He dropped it off at my house one afternoon, the trunk looking ancient and full of secrets. "It's a long shot, Claire," he'd said, "but whatever your sister is looking for might have its origins in here." That evening, I hauled the heavy trunk up the rickety pull-down stairs to my attic. The air up there was thick and still, smelling of cedar, dust, and time itself. A single bare bulb cast long, dancing shadows across the rafters, illuminating stacks of my own forgotten boxes. I knelt on the rough wooden floorboards and ran my hand over the trunk's worn leather. With a deep breath, I lifted the heavy lid. A wave of nostalgia, so potent it ached, washed over me as the scent of my grandmother's lavender sachets filled the air. Inside were relics of a life I barely knew, delicate lace-trimmed dresses, a stack of photo albums, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon. At the very bottom, tucked beneath a layer of yellowed tissue paper, was a manila folder. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a document, several pages long, held together by a rusty staple. The letterhead was from an old, defunct law firm, and the title at the top made my heart stop. Last Will and Testament of Margaret Bennett, my grandmother. I began to read, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. Most of it was standard, small bequests to distant relatives, her jewelry left to my mother, and then I found it, a section that laid out a provision for a homestead fund, setting aside an amount roughly equivalent to the value of my $237K house. The will stated the fund was intended to secure a home for her youngest granddaughter, Laura. A cold knot formed in my stomach. So it was true. This was the inheritance Laura was talking about, but the next clause was what made the world tilt on its axis. The will stipulated that if another heir, and it named me, Claire Bennett, specifically, were to purchase a primary residence and subsequently default on the loan within the first 5 years, ownership of that property would legally transfer to Laura to satisfy the homestead provision. It was a setup, a perfectly legal, horrifyingly cruel trap. The lawsuit, their demands, their feigned concern, it was all designed to put so much financial and emotional pressure on me that I would fail, that I would break. A sharp, painful image of my grandmother's smiling face from the photograph flashed in my mind, a symbol of love and warmth. How could she have done this? How could the woman who taught me to bake cookies have signed a document that essentially booby-trapped my future? The inner monologue was a scream of disbelief. They planned this from the start. How much more can I take? A floorboard creaked downstairs. My head snapped up, my entire body going rigid. I wasn't expecting anyone. I held my breath, listening. I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps in my living room. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a hefty photo album, and crept silently to the top of the attic stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peered down into the hallway below, and I saw her. It was Laura, standing in the middle of my house as if she owned it, her eyes wild and searching. She must have used an old key she never returned. She looked up and saw me. Our eyes locked. For a second we were both frozen. Then, her gaze dropped to the will clutched in my hand. Her face crumpled. It wasn't the look of a master manipulator caught in the act. It was the look of a cornered animal. "You found it," she whispered, her voice cracking. She started up the stairs, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "How could you?" I asked, my own voice a stranger's, low and trembling with a rage so profound it felt like it could split the earth. "How could Grandma do this to me?" Tears streamed down Laura's face, leaving clean tracks in the foundation she wore. "She didn't," Laura sobbed, the words ripping from her throat. "Grandma didn't do it. I did." The world stopped. The sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, it all faded away. "What? I forged it," she confessed. her voice choked with desperation. "I found a guy online. He knew how to get old paper, how to fake the signatures. I studied her real will, the one that left us each a small savings bond. I made this one." She gestured wildly at the papers in my hand. "I had to do it, don't you see?" Her voice rose to a frantic pitch. "I had to do it. Mom and Dad were broke because of me. The loan, the gambling, they were going to lose their house. I thought if I could get this house, I could sell it and pay everything back. I could fix it." The confession hung in the dusty attic air between us, monstrous and pathetic. She hadn't just manipulated me. She hadn't just lied. She had committed a serious crime. She had desecrated the memory of our grandmother to fuel her own selfish, destructive plans. I looked down at the forged will in my hand, the key to her destruction, and perhaps my own salvation. Then I looked at my sister, a broken, sobbing mess on the stairs below me. The power in our relationship, for the first time in my entire life, had shifted completely. The truth was out. The question was, what was I going to do with it? After Laura's confession, a hollow silence descended upon the attic, thick with the dust of generations and the fresh poison of her lies. I watched her stumble back down the stairs, a broken, sobbing mess, and I didn't follow. I couldn't. I needed to be alone in that quiet, forgotten space, with the ghosts of the past and the ugly, tangible proof of my family's betrayal clutched in my hand. The forged will felt heavy, weighted with years of deceit. I sank down onto the dusty floorboards, my back against the old leather trunk, and let the silence swallow me. It was in that profound quiet that the memories, long suppressed, began to surface. My mind drifted back, pulling me into a memory so vivid it felt like the present. I was 16 again, standing in the doorway of our old Victorian house. The air smelled of turpentine and my mother's rose-scented potpourri. It was a Friday night, and the exhaustion of an 8-hour shift at the diner settled deep in my bones, a familiar, weary ache. My uniform stank of grease and stale coffee, but in my hand I was clutching my paycheck, a crisp paper rectangle that represented 40 hours of hard work. It was my ticket out, my future, and I was so proud I could burst. But no one noticed. In the living room, my parents, Richard and Ellen, were gathered around an easel, their faces glowing with adoration. On it sat Laura's latest masterpiece, a chaotic, messy canvas of clashing, garish colors that was supposed to be a sunset over a lake. She had taken up painting that month, her latest fleeting passion. "Oh, Laura, it's brilliant," my mother gushed, her hand on her heart. "You have such a gift, such a unique vision." My father nodded in solemn agreement, his eyes shining. "Your daughter has real talent, Ellen, true artistic spirit." I stood in the doorway, invisible. My paycheck, the physical proof of my discipline and sacrifice, felt flimsy and worthless in my hand. I had worked all week, contributing to my own savings, never asking for a dime. Laura had spent the week making a mess with expensive paints my father had bought her, and she was the one being celebrated as a prodigy. I quietly slipped away to my room, the sound of their fawning praise following me down the hall. I folded my paycheck and tucked it into the glass jar under my bed, the small clink of the coins the only applause I ever received. The memory faded, leaving me back in the dusty silence of my own attic, the forged will lying in my lap. And with that one memory came a flood of others, a lifetime of similar moments clicking into place like a row of falling dominoes. Laura getting the new bike while I inherited her old one. Laura's college tuition paid without question while I worked 2 jobs to put myself through nursing school. Laura was the delicate, artistic one who needed to be nurtured and protected, whose whims were indulged as signs of a creative spirit. I was the responsible one, the workhorse, the utility player whose self-sufficiency was not a virtue to be praised, but a convenience to be taken for granted. I finally saw it with a blinding, painful clarity. Their favoritism wasn't just neglectful. It was the very soil in which Laura's twisted sense of entitlement had grown. They had cultivated her belief that she deserved the world without working for it, while I was taught that my worth was measured only by my labor. They hadn't just created a monster. They had punished me for not being one. A new strength, born of pure, undiluted anger and decades of resentment, solidified within me. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about my entire life. All those years of being second, I won't let it define me now. My path forward was suddenly clear. I would not be their silent, long-suffering daughter anymore. I walked down from the attic, leaving the trunk and its ghosts behind. But I brought the forged will with me. I sat in my living room, the document lying on the coffee table, a symbol of my new power. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but my heart knew instantly who it was from. It was my mother. The message was long and rambling, a torrent of frantic, self-serving words. "Claire, I know you spoke to Laura. She told us everything. We are so ashamed. We never meant for things to go this far. We were just so scared, so desperate. Please, you have to find it in your heart to forgive us. We're your family." I stared at the screen, the phone's cold blue light illuminating my face in the dim room. Forgive them. It wasn't an apology. It was another demand, another attempt to manage my emotions to soothe their own guilt. They weren't sorry for what they did. They were sorry they got caught. The text wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a plea for absolution, for me to once again be the responsible one and clean up the mess. The damage wasn't just deep. It was the very foundation of who we were. Could I forgive them, or was it finally time to burn the whole rotten structure to the ground? I stared at my mother's text message, the desperate plea for forgiveness glowing in the dark of my living room. For a long moment, I felt the old, familiar pull of duty, the lifetime of training to be the one who smooths things over, the one who cleans up the mess. But then, the image of the forged will, the memory of Laura's wild-eyed confession, and the echo of my father's courtroom betrayal all rose up, forming a new, unbreachable wall inside me. With a steady finger, I deleted the entire message thread. I didn't reply. The next morning, I placed the forged will into a manila envelope, sealed it, and gave it to Detective Carter for safekeeping. "I'll decide what to do with it later," I told him, my voice firm. "Right now, I have to live." My first act of true freedom was to declare war on the bland, beige walls of my house. Those walls had absorbed weeks of my fear, my anger, and my sorrow. They were soaked in the memory of betrayal. They had to go. I mentioned my plan to Mark, and the next thing I knew, my front door was opening to a small, chaotic army of friends. Mark, along with 3 other people from the support group, arrived on Saturday morning armed with paint rollers, brushes, and cheap pizza. For the first time in months, my house was filled with noise, not the tense silence of my family's judgment or the terrifying quiet of my own fear, but the sound of laughter, of a terrible 90s pop playlist blasting from a portable speaker, of friendly arguments over who had gotten more paint on the floor than on the walls. The air, thick with the chemical smell of fresh paint, felt clean, like it was purging the last toxic remnants of my family's presence. At one point, Mark accidentally flicked a glob of sea green paint onto my cheek, and instead of being annoyed, I just laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that came from my gut. As I looked around at these near strangers, my chosen family, all of us covered in paint and sweat, a memory of that horrible family dinner flashed in my mind, the forced cheer, the brittle smiles, the cold, calculating tension that had sat at the table with us. This, right here, was the opposite of that. This was real. This was warmth. This was community. We weren't bound by blood, but by a shared understanding of what it meant to survive the darkness. By the end of the day, my living room was a vibrant, hopeful sea green. The house felt lighter, like it could finally breathe again. And so could I. But in the quiet that evening, after my friends had gone, I noticed a different kind of emptiness. It wasn't the hollow void of loneliness anymore, but a simple quiet, a space waiting to be filled with something new, something good. That's what led me to the Austin Animal Shelter the next weekend. The moment I walked in, I was hit by a wall of sound, a cacophony of hopeful, desperate barks, and the clean, slightly antiseptic smell of a place trying its best. I walked slowly down the concrete aisle, looking into the kennels at dogs of every shape and size, and then I saw her. In the very last cage, a small, scruffy mutt with mismatched ears and the saddest eyes I had ever seen was huddled in the far corner, trembling. While all the other dogs barked and jumped for attention, she just watched me, silent and scared. My heart broke, because I knew exactly how she felt. I knelt down in front of her cage. "Hey there," I whispered. She didn't move, but one of her ears twitched. I sat there for 20 minutes just talking to her quietly, until she finally took one tentative step forward, and then another. An hour later, she was curled up on the passenger seat of my car, her head in my lap. I named her Hope. It was cheesy, I knew, but it was also the truest thing in the world. She had been abandoned, betrayed, and left to fend for herself, and so had I. We were going to heal together. The following week was one of the happiest I'd had in a year. Hope brought life and laughter back into my quiet house. We went for long walks, played fetch in my now green living room, and curled up on the sofa together. One sunny afternoon, we were at a nearby park. I was throwing a bright red ball for her, my laughter echoing in the open air as she bounded after it with clumsy, joyful abandon. In that moment, surrounded by the green grass and the warm sun, with my dog happily panting at my feet, I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost made me cry. I was okay. I was going to be okay. And then I saw her. Across the sprawling lawn, standing under the deep shade of an old oak tree, was a lone figure. My laughter died in my throat. The red ball fell from my hand. It was Laura. She was just standing there, her hands shoved in her pockets, partially obscured by the shadows. She wasn't moving or shouting. She was just watching me and my new dog, watching my moment of pure, untarnished happiness. My blood ran cold. Hope, sensing my sudden tension, let out a low growl. We stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, me and my dog on one side of the park, my sister a silent, ominous statue on the other. Then, as if she had seen enough, Laura turned and walked away, disappearing behind a line of trees. She was gone, but her presence lingered, a cold shadow falling over my perfect sunny day. This house is mine again, but why do I feel her shadow still? Her silent, watchful return felt more menacing than any threat she could have screamed. What did it mean? What was she planning now? Laura's silent appearance in the park was the last gasp of the storm. After she vanished, the fear I'd expected to feel didn't rush back in. In its place was a quiet, unshakable calm. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. I finally understood that her power over me was rooted in my fear, and I wasn't afraid anymore. A few days later, I drove to my parents' house, the forged will in a sealed envelope on the passenger seat. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I simply laid out the facts, the debts, the lies, the forgery. I told them that my forgiveness was not something they could demand, and that my support was no longer something they could take for granted. Then I left, the weight of a lifetime of expectations lifting from my shoulders with every step I took back to my car. For Laura, I offered one final choice: get professional help for her gambling addiction, or I would hand the evidence of her crime over to the police. The choice was hers. With that, I was finally, truly free. 2 months later, my backyard was filled with the exact life I had always dreamed of. The Texas sun was warm and bright, the air smelled of freshly cut grass and grilling burgers, and the sound of laughter, real, unrestrained laughter, echoed off the walls of my little craftsman house. Mark was at the grill, arguing playfully with 2 of my friends from the support group about the correct way to flip a burger. My dog, Hope, was bounding across the lawn, chasing a frisbee. My house wasn't just a structure of wood and nails anymore. It was a home, alive with the warmth and light of people who had seen me at my worst and chosen to stay. I stood on my porch, watching them, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand. This was my family now, a motley crew of survivors and kind souls, a family chosen, not forced. I had finally come home. Just as I was soaking in the peace, the latch on the backyard gate clicked open. My friends' laughter trailed off as we all turned to look. It was Laura. She stood there, hesitant and frail, looking nothing like the manipulative storm of a woman she had been. She looked small, lost. Mark put a supportive hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. I gave his hand a grateful squeeze and walked across the lawn to meet her, creating a quiet space between my past and my present. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the grass, her hands twisting nervously. "I'm going to meetings," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For the gambling, like you said." I nodded slowly. That's good, Laura." Finally, she looked up, her eyes swimming with a shame that for the first time looked genuine. "I'm sorry, Claire," she said, the words sounding rusty, unused. "I went too far. What I did, it was monstrous. I'm so sorry." I looked at my sister, at the ruins of the person she had been and the fragile seedling of the person she was trying to become. The old familiar anger was gone. The resentment had dissolved. All I felt was a great, sad distance. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs clean and fresh. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. The forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. It was the final cinder block I had to lay down to complete the foundation of my new life. "I forgive you," I repeated, "but I'm done carrying you." A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she nodded in understanding. She knew what I meant. There would be no more money, no more fixing her messes, no more setting myself on fire to keep her warm. Our relationship, if it was ever to exist again, would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, on the new, solid ground of respect and responsibility. She gave me a small, sad smile, turned, and walked away, leaving me standing in the sun, finally at peace. I walked back to my friends, back to the warmth and the laughter. I picked up Hope's red ball and threw it for her, watching her leap into the air with pure joy. The journey had been a descent into hell, but I had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not just intact, but stronger. I had learned the hardest and most important lesson of my life. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who respect your journey, who lift you up instead of tearing you down. You deserve to build your own home, inside and out. Thank you for following my journey from the beginning. If this story of resilience resonated with you, I hope you'll hit that like button and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Share your own struggles with family and finding your strength in the comments below. Reading your stories reminds us all that we are not alone. And if you're new here, feel free to binge watch my entire story from part 1. Thank you for listening.